Welcome to the Measure Success podcast, where I talk with top leaders about effective strategies that inspire success. Very excited to have with us Perry Marshall, a business strategist, author, and leading expert on applying the 80-20 principle to sales, marketing, and business growth. He's best known for his book 80-20 Sales and Marketing and his expertise in Google Ads, helping businesses to maximize profits by focusing on their most valuable customer and activities. But the world is changing a lot. And Perry, I'm going to just on our little preamble here, I'm just going to go a little bit further. We were talking about, and we're going to go into right now. There's a difference between 80-20 and 90-10. And before I hit into that, I'm just going to touch on something. So folks, this bio that I just said over Perry, in the past, I used to have somebody on my team, and they would prepare this set of questions and they'd prepare a bio. And typically they'd ask the bio to come from the person, hey, this is what we want to say. Well, with ChatGPT, the 4.0, the easy version, right, that you pay $20 for, I can in 2 seconds get that information. There's no reason for me to even have that prep information anymore because I can get it instantaneously. These are the things and changes that just changed in just a few years, right, of recording podcasts when we started recording podcasts in 2021 to where we are today in 2025. The world has changed a lot. So Perry, for simplicity, for those who don't know, once again, welcome to the podcast. Explain to people what the 80-20 principle is first, because I'm sure there's a few people who don't know the Pareto principle. I don't know who they are, but I'm sure there's somebody. And then we'll go 90-20, 90-10, sorry.
It is the most powerful principle that nobody taught you about. And I'm guessing most people have heard of it. Most people have some notion that 80% of your revenue comes from 20% of your customers, and that 80% of the real estate is owned by 20% of the people. That's called the Pareto principle. And I used to think that this was just an interesting business factoid. No, it is a fundamental law of cause and effect in the universe. And it's true of rivers and earthquakes and sand dunes and the traffic. The traffic in your town is 80-20. 80% of the traffic is on 20% of the roads. And 80% of the traffic is on 20% of 20% of the roads. And 80 of the 80 is 20 of the 20 of 20. So that means 50% of the cars are driving on 1% of the roads. So that's the expressways. That's true. And when I realized that it's true in almost everything in a business, it completely demolished my previous notion of how business works. And I was about a year and a half into the business I'm in now. I was a new consultant. I sent a memo to my biggest client. I said, we're doing an 80-20 analysis on your business starting next week. And we did. And we made huge improvements in that business. And we could talk for an hour just about 80-20. But Carl, what you're bringing up is that large parts of the world have shifted to be even more unequal. It's not 80-20 anymore. It's 90-10 or even 95-5 or even 99-1. And the more digital it is and the more frictionless it is, the more unequal it is. People think that equality, like technology and capabilities and internet and stuff like that, makes people more equal. No, it makes them more unequal. And this is one of the most important things that you can know about the next 10 years and where we're headed. It changes the way you think about products. It changes the kind of industry you choose to go into, the kind of customer you choose to serve. And there are a lot of choices here. And so I hope we can unpack this and give people a sense of where the world is going before it gets there.
Yeah, and what's taking this a step further, right? Just on that technology piece that's happening. Don't fool yourself. You can't keep up.
Hmm.
I mean, just be honest, right? It's going at such a fast rate. Us as humans, we can't keep up.
That's right.
But you have to do the best you can to grab onto the few things. This is once again why that isolation of what makes us great, of being really, really good at those things that can't be quickly figured out in ChatGPT, right? Where is our discernment and value in the world and marketplace? Or are we going to be replaced by a 2-second inquiry into ChatGPT and get the answer and go, why do I even need you to begin with, right? How are you and I as humans, right, going to continue to be relevant? How are you and I as businesses going to continue to be relevant when information becomes more and more and more free? But I'll say this, Perry, and you know this. Information I felt has always been free. Decision making is the difference. People don't make decisions. And I think actually, if anything that's happening today, because of the overwhelming change of technology, we're getting more frozen than ever before. So with that like in there, so first of all, can comment on that. Are you observing that? Do you see that with your clients, people out there in the marketplace where there's this, I don't know what to do next?
Yes. And I want to tell you a story. When I was probably 12, I was in a record store and I picked up the first Boston album, the one with More Than a Feeling and all those songs on it. And it on the back of the album, of course, I was looking at an LP. It had this, you'd probably call it a liner note, but it was this explanation. Okay, who is this band Boston that nobody's ever heard of? And he sort of tells you about where they came from. But he says, Boston is created by this genius from MIT named Tom Schatz. And he's like a rocket scientist and he invented all these cool technologies for guitar distortion. And it really, there for its time, it was extremely technologically advanced. But it went way out of its way to make the point. Yes, this album has lots of technology, but the technology does not run the music. The music dictates the technology. Listen to the music. And it reiterated this several times and it would say, listen to the music, listen to the music, listen to the music. And I read that and it stuck with me. It was like, okay, you could have this really cool keyboard sound or this really cool guitar sound. We've all heard albums where, boy, that's really cool the first time you hear it. And then 2 years later, you're like, oh, that just sounds so dated. That sounds so 1993 or, whatever. And that Boston album has aged very well. And that little write-up on the back of the album is exactly how you have to approach technology at any level, whether it's AI or whatever. You are the artist. You are making a decision as to what kind of thing you're going to create and what boxes does it need to check and what criteria and what are the bottlenecks that it's going to deal with and all of that. And the technology can do it a million ways for you and it can do it fast and you can iterate and reiterate and try again and try again. You do that all to your heart's content, but you have to decide what it's going to be. And you need to exercise your agency and your vision and your sense of what's beautiful and what's effective and what would be a satisfying outcome for you and for other people. And most people are just carried along by it. And they're like the 1980s song that had a certain synthesizer sound. that just sounds so 1980s, and nobody wants to listen to it anymore because it just makes you feel like you've got embarrassing hair or pimples or something. And yes, so 100 times yes to what you said. And the technology actually empowers individuals to a degree like never before to advance faster than ever before. And it makes the world 99-1. So that means you have to pick your battles very carefully.
Indeed. And it was interesting as you're sharing there. In my early days as a CFO, a young 30-ish year old CFO reporting to a bunch of, which I felt was then old, which I am now, these 50-year-old board members, right? And I remember putting together information and having all the facts. And for me, the facts created a very clear decision. But then I learned through continuously sharing these same facts that people would not be making decisions based on the facts. They were making decisions based on their emotion, right? Their beliefs, their values. That's ultimately what was changing decisions. I remember very clearly for multiple quarters sharing that this business that we were in was not going to probably ever make money. But the people didn't want to hear it because they felt so aligned with it. It was the thing for this to help grow our business. It wasn't until we had a slight downturn that we finally had the courage to kill it, right? But
Yep.
it was not the right thing. But people didn't want to deal with the facts, and so that's the weird part of like the emotion, right? And all this data. Just because you have all the data doesn't mean people are going to make right decisions. We see this every day. I have in front of me Starbucks, which I probably shouldn't have got today. Well, it wasn't too bad. Decaf with oat milk. Okay, it's a little bit of improvement. and then I got this oatmeal, right, sitting here in this cup here. Questionable whether it's good or wrong. But we had the data to know whether they're right decisions. But we make this comfort decisions all the time, right?
Yeah.
Even though we should be making better decisions. So in the business side, right, once again, when you're talking to people, let's just keep on going down this 90-10 or 95-5. How does somebody practically change? Like, let's say they've been doing the 80-20 pretty well, and they're kind of stuck there.
Well,
what does it mean to them to take the next level?
Okay, so first of all, most people are not doing 80-20 well.
That's true. That's fair.
Most people do not understand what 80-20 is. They've all heard of it. They talk about it. They throw it around. Most people do not understand it. So let's back up a couple steps.
Let me applaud that because I see it in nearly every business that they don't. So I agree.
So 80-20 says that cause and effect are hugely disproportional, and that most causes produce not very much effect, and a few causes make a huge amount of effect. And so 80% of your business comes from 20% of your customers. 2/3 of your business comes from 5% of your customers, and half your business comes from 1% of your customers. And then I can switch out different words. 80% of your productivity comes from 20% of your employees. 50% of your productivity comes from 1% of your employees. 1% of the authors write 50% of the books. 1% of the YouTubers make 50% of the videos. 1% of the YouTubers get 50% of the views. 1% of the product defects cause 50% of the product returns. And then there's a downside, which is 10% of your product line is losing money, not making money. 10% of your clients are losing you money, not making you money. 10% of your employees cost you 5 to 14 times their salary. I've got a good friend, longtime client, Nancy Schlesinger.
Wait. Say that again.
So I'm going to say it
that
again,
one more time.
and I'm going to back it up. Nancy Schlesinger, longtime recruiter, has run a recruiting company for 30 years. She told me a bad employee costs 5 to 14 times their salary. And when she first told me that, I thought, 2 to 5. She said 5 to 14. Then I fired my bookkeeper. Then I found out I brought in a better bookkeeper. And then I found out how many messes the old bookkeeper had left behind. There were hundreds of, I think, how much? I forget. There were at least 5 figures worth of invoices that she had never sent. And well, what's going to happen to your relationships if you send somebody a 3-year-old invoice for $10,000 and say, you didn't pay this? How's that for the relationship? That's what a bad bookkeeper costs. How about morale? You know that B players drive out A players and attract C players? There's all kinds of things in business. There's sinkholes. There are little parts of the business that are sucking huge amounts of energy. There are other small parts of the business that are generating huge amounts of energy, and most of it is just a wash. So I remember the first time I was taught about 80-20. I read a book and it said 80% of the business comes from 20% of the clients. I doubted that when I read it. So I printed out a QuickBooks report of all of the customers from the biggest to the smallest in order. And I went down through it with my calculator and I added it up as I went down. And sure enough, when I got 1/5 of the way through that report, I was at 80% of the revenue. I was like, well, that's interesting. And then I didn't get it. So we had this guy named Dimitri. We sold hardware and software. And Dimitri's company only bought a couple $1,000s of stuff every year. He's a very small customer. And he would rake me over the coals about the features I didn't have. And, if you guys don't add this new feature, I'm just going to go to your competition. He would rub our competition in our face. And I would get all wrapped around the axle and I would email the software developer and I would say, could we have this feature? This is for a teeny tiny little customer. Meanwhile, everybody's got another customer. Once every 6 or 8 months, they fax in or email in some big invoice or a big purchase order. You ship them the stuff. Nobody calls you. There's no squeaky wheel. Nobody knows what they do. Nobody's ever been there. Nobody's ever called them. Nobody had lunch with them. Ignore Dimitri and go find that customer that sends you that mysterious purchase order every 6 months and get on a plane and go see them, or at least call somebody and find out, who are you guys and what do you guys do? And are you happy with this? This happens over because squeaky wheels get the grease. So I didn't really get 80-20 the first time I read about it. When I really got it was I was reading an 80-20 book and it never explained it. It just mentioned that 80-20 has to do with chaos theory, which is the part of science that deals with avalanches and storms and weather and stuff like that. And I had read a book about that, and I knew that chaos theory is a pattern inside a pattern inside a pattern inside a pattern. In other words, a tiny little crack on your windshield is identical to the San Andreas Fault. It's just a lot smaller. One's a lot smaller, one's a lot bigger, but they operate exactly the same. And I go, whoa, wait a minute. If this is chaos theory, then that means there's an 80-20 inside every 80-20. So it means 20% of the 20% produces 80% of the 80, and 20 cubed produces 80 cubed, and it just keeps going. Whoa! That means it's basically a law of physics that somebody's as rich as Jeff Bezos. It's basically a law of physics that 1% of your customers give you half of your money. It's basically a law of physics that everything in the world is highly unequal. It's basically a law of physics that 20% of the alcoholics are going to buy 80% of the alcohol. Mm-hmm. And you can't change that. You can only harness that. And I suddenly realized that most of what I learned in school trained me to ignore 80/20 and push the opposite way. So straight A student is a person who's equally good at all 5 or 6 or 7 things, and they're well-rounded and attaboy, and you're so great. Well, you know what? Being a straight A student is almost the antithesis of being really, 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 really good at something that people would actually pay you for. If you're a software engineer and you're being paid to write great code, the anthropology class doesn't matter. The history class doesn't matter. The phys ed class doesn't matter. What matters is, do you know Python, and do you know scripts, and do you know how to do all these things? And money spent getting better at that one thing that the person's already great at is 100 times more effective than fixing all his weaknesses. So how many sales departments are there where you got some like incredibly good sales guy and he can sell ice to Eskimos and he can close, and there's some person, his boss or somebody in his department, is hounding him. Your expense reports are terrible. And they're torturing the guy. And they won't hire a $15 an hour assistant to go along behind him and pick up his shoebox of receipts and get his spreadsheet right. That guy doesn't care about all that. And they will torture that guy until he quits and leaves the company. And then they're like, hey, how come we lost the Acme account? Well, Fred got so tired of arguing with Betty that he just took a different job. I mean,
Barry, this is so funny that you're talking about this, guys. Literally, we had a dinner conversation about this the other day. My father-in-law, amazing human being, many different skills and things that he's done in his life, but one of his gifts is he was a great salesperson. And he worked for Alcoa back in the day, and Alcoa was one of the best Salesforce organizations back in that period of time. And what they would do is they would have 3 salespeople to 1 assistant. And that assistant would make sure that all the messy stuff, travel expense reports, vouchers, whatever they needed,
plane tickets,
get taken care of. The plane tickets, because they hated that stuff because they hated details.
Yeah.
What they were great at was connecting with the customer to make an emotional decision. And what's so interesting is, as a person with a background in a CPA, who is a CPA, who has an accounting firm, when I was working within companies, I remember 2 key things. One is we had a great salesperson. They weren't turning their expense reports, and we did the exact thing. We were trying to fire him because he wasn't turning his expense reports, as opposed to just like what you said. The other thing was the worst thing, and you'll get this. They wanted to fire the salesperson because he was making more than the CEO.
Yep.
And what happened? They changed the compensation package so he no longer had higher incentives. And what happened? We no longer got big contracts anymore.
Yep.
This was with a public traded company.
Yeah.
And it's amazing when our ego and stupid decisions like accountants on worrying about they're not the right person because they're not filling out their expense report, they're lacking integrity. No, that's not their strength. That's not their gift. That's not what they're great at. Solve the problem, right? With, once again, low tech, get it taken care of, and then all of a sudden your sales go well. Treat those people well, even if they're not normal.
Giftedness is one of the huge 80/20 levers. And giftedness is always eccentric and lopsided and funny. And in my book, 80/20 Sales and Marketing, we have a login to a tool called the Marketing DNA Test. And it measures how do you sell, market, and persuade. Not how should you, how do you naturally market,
Mm-hmm.
and persuade. And the reason I created that tool was I'm in the marketing space and I wrote the book on Google and Facebook advertising, and I've met every kind of marketer and salesperson you've ever seen in your life. And here's what over and over, as people, they get into it and they realize, oh, I got to pick this up. I got to learn this stuff. Well, what do I got to do? They are blitzkrieged with a million things. Oh, you need to learn video sales letters. You need to learn AI. You
Mm.
need to learn copywriting. You need negotiation. You need to do a YouTube channel. It goes on and on and on. And what I would see over and over and over is people who had a superpower that they were really good at, like, let's say, a really good hostage negotiator level sales guy who can, like, herd cats and deal with ammunition and shrapnel and all of it, and come home with the hostages intact. He's trying to be a copywriter. There's no way, it's never going to happen. Or he's trying to be like a video guy or something, or vice versa. You'd have like the amazing copywriter who's trying to, they want to go speak to audiences and get people to rush to the back of the room, but writers are too cerebral and that just doesn't really work. And I would see people trying to be something they're not. And so I spent several months, I put this thing together, and one of the early people that took that test was a guy named Josh Earl. He was an app developer for software, and his marketing DNA test said you would be a great copywriter. A year and a half later, he hit six figures doing freelance copywriting, and he left software development, which he thought was boring and tedious.
Wow.
And he's been in that world ever since. And so most people are trying to fix their weaknesses, and they can't even quite see what they're really super good at because it's so innate. And then when you combine it with the fact that Phyllis from accounting is chasing you around for your expense reports and guilting you into thinking you're a slob, well, yeah, I know there is a cheeseburger under your seat and it's 2 months old, but since the clients are never in your car, it doesn't really matter.
This has been fantastic. Okay, so you mentioned about that test you have. So when you're with your clients, I'm kind of really curious about your answer here. How are you measuring success with them?
Well, everybody has their own way of measuring success. And what I think of successful and what they think of successful may not be the same. But then let's contrast it with what you're supposed to consider successful. So I have a client who started working with me 2 years ago. And the first 2 hours of our very first meeting, he flew to Chicago and spent a day with me. We spent the first 2 hours discussing the fact that he had been offered over $100 million for his company. And he was very flattered by that. And he was very intrigued by that. But as we discussed this, what became very clear is he's in an extremely mediocre, old school industry that does things a bunch of really bass-ackward ways. He had built an incredible system that's light years better than the norm. He's still relatively small player, even though he's growing very fast. And he can't think of anybody in the entire industry that he would comfortably sell his business to and believe that they would adhere to his very principled values that led to building the kind of company that he built, because he built it based on an ethic, not just like getting an MBA or reading a book or something like that. They want their customers treated a certain way. They think about money a certain way. They think about life a certain way. And they train their people in a very certain way. And I said, look me in the eye, dude. I said, you are under no obligation whatsoever to sell this thing to anybody. You've got enough money, you're happy, you're doing what you love, you're really good at it. Yeah, it would be a great feather in your cap, and it would make great headlines. But I know a lot of people that sold their company, and 2 weeks later, they're having an existential crisis. So they got nothing to do. They're hitting refresh on their Schwab account 136 times a day in Starbucks, which is really boring after a while. And they lose their purpose, and they lose their sense of direction and drive. I said, here's what I suggest we do. I suggest we grow this thing and grow this thing and grow this thing until we snap the spinal cord of this industry, because you can drive a lot of those guys out of business if you just stay focused. And that is exactly what he's doing. I want to say that business has grown 70 or 80% in the 2 years. And this is not tech. This is not biotech. It's not AI. It's very old school. It's press the flesh. Not the kind of business you expect to have mid double-digit growth. And he is happy, and he is going after it. And so I think a lot of people aren't even sure what makes them happy. I think a lot of people are so caught up in workaholism that they don't even remember what they enjoy anymore. And if you give them a day off or a week off, they don't even know what to do with themselves.
You answered, you really literally crossed both chasms there, Perry, of what we were talking a little bit beforehand before we answered that, why I love to ask the question. Because success, you and I both have had the fortunate thing of knowing many people who never have to work a day again in their life.
Mm-hmm.
But they all of a sudden, they lose their, you just nailed it, they lose their purpose. They don't have a plan for the afterward.
Yeah.
When there's no plan for the afterward, it is like being in purgatory, right?
Yeah.
Because
yes.
They literally don't know what to do. And their whole ego and everything there was they were a CEO, a founder of XYZ company. And yes, they have more money than they have in the bank account, but they haven't found purpose. I literally, one of the people we work with, I was working with a private equity company. I said the story multiple times in the air, but it just always still cracks me up. He was saying a little too much about all the great things he had accomplished in his life and all the boats and all the houses and all the cars and all the things. But the funniest thing he said is, Carl, if I see one more luxury pool, I'm going to drown myself in it.
Wow. Boy, there's a lot of layers to that comment. You could have like a 3-hour therapy session just on that one remark.
Yes, it was a lot. And, but there it is, right? There's this, what is joyful. I think where you're getting at, there's when you can become great at something, why give it up? And what's even more important is when you can, the whole 80-20 is if you can create a business and a system with great values, and you can I want to be careful of saying this, appropriately relieving unnecessary stress from the business. Right. There's the stress that makes us fun, which we enjoy. And then there's the unnecessary stress of worrying about things that we don't need to worry about.
Yes.
And when you could find a way to focus on the things you love to worry about, you love to solve problems with, versus the things that you don't, that make you tired. And this goes back to, it's funny, you mentioned strengths. Gallup Strengths Finder all talks about focus on your strengths. Don't worry about your weaknesses, because you can't really move the dial on them anyways.
Yeah.
Right. We're not talking about skills. We're talking about innate strengths, right? Things that make us naturally intuitive based on who we are to do the things that we're great at. So Perry, let's go ahead and add this question to you. Let's get just out of curiosity. You've been able to have success with your life. And I just, once again, I love the way how you think. What type of habits have you ingrained in your own personal life, right, that has helped you be successful and be successful with your clients?
So the best habit I have cultivated in my adult life is what I call Renaissance time. And that is the first minutes of my day, I'm not death scrolling. I'm not in my email box. I'm not on a screen. I'm not watching TV. I set aside spiritual, contemplative, meditative space to think and pray and get myself centered. I do it every day, 7 days a week. I haven't missed a day in 11 years.
Wow.
Best habit I've cultivated. And I move on to the next thing after I feel I'm done.
Mm.
And I ask myself questions like, what is the biggest question that I am trying to answer today that I don't have an answer to? And what mindset do I need to bring to the various things that are happening today? And I write them down. I get clear about it. Then and only then do I move on with the rest of the day.
Hmm.
And a lot of people have a very hard time doing this for several reasons. The first reason is they have a lizard brain that wants a dopamine hit and is looking for a crisis. And it's really easy to just go open an email box and start answering questions and solving crises and putting out fires. And it temporarily makes you feel better, but it immediately puts you in reaction mode right off the beginning of the day. When, think about it, you've just woken up from sleeping, you're fresh, you were probably dreaming about something, there's probably thoughts that have floated to the top of your mind. Stop, capture those, orient yourself, and then decide what kind of day that you want to have and what your priorities are, and look at your schedule and decide how to order and structure things. And that has been an immensely productive habit that it just keeps feeding and feeding the energy and the juice and the creativity that makes everything else happen.
That's brilliant. I love that. Okay. Not one of your own books, but what is a book, maybe recently or just a tried and true book that you typically recommend to somebody else?
I assume this needs to be books other people wrote.
Yes, please. Yes.
Well, one book that I think is hugely underrated is The Star Principle by Richard Koch.
Mm-hmm.
Richard is a very good friend of mine. We've now been friends for about 12 years. He's a billionaire. But he wrote the original 80/20 book that set my mind on fire, which I read 20 years ago. Richard, his return on capital rivals Warren Buffett. He's worth $1.6 billion. And he achieves more leverage, more output for input than any other person I have ever met. And I have met a lot of successful people. He wrote a book called Star Principle, which encapsulates his most important business strategy, which is you only invest in, build, start companies that are number one in a market that's growing 10% or more a year. Richard says Star Principle is more important than 80/20. And we have designed our mentoring programs, our teaching, our seminars to revolve around Star Principle, because Star Principle is like 80/20. It's fractal. STAR principle is really an application of 80-20, and it says, what are the 20% of businesses that produce 80% of profits? They are businesses that are number one in their market, and their market is growing. And so 80-20 is the most powerful single skill when you roll STAR principle into that. 80-20 is the most universal skill. And if you know how and when to apply it, first of all, you can figure out which problems aren't worth solving. Some problems aren't solvable. Some companies aren't salvageable. Some markets are not worth selling to. And then you can solve the solvable problems.
I wish we had more time to go down that path, but we're ending here. Perry, how can people connect and learn more about what you're doing?
You can get 80-20 sales and marketing for $7, including shipping, at perrymarshall.com/podcast. You go to perrymarshall.com/podcast. We have a special offer there. You can buy it for $20 on Amazon, but you can get it for a third the price with a bunch of extra goodies, some videos and some trainings, and the marketing DNA test at the link that I just told you. And it will change your life. It will completely reorient what you see when you look out the window.
Perry, I really so grateful that you had the opportunity to be on the Measure Success podcast today.
I'm grateful for having you on. You asked some really great questions, and I love your story about the swimming pools. That was good. Thank you.
Absolutely. And to whoever else is listening, I hope you've enjoyed listening to Perry Marshall. Once again, I encourage you to go out, read his materials. He provided a great offer on that. I definitely encourage you to go out and learn more about that. And once again, the reason why we continue to grow and continue to gain credibility is because of you providing feedback to me directly, to liking, sharing, etc. When you do this on social media, that means the world to us when you actually do that. So thank you so much. And as we always like to say, wishing you the very best and measuring your success. Have a great day.